You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Feel like who art Ed?
We tried to spice it.
Who art is Mr. Wood, art Ed me?
Yeah. Either way, it's ambiguous. It works on so many levels.
I know.
That's off to a great start.
Welcome to Who Arted, weekly art history for all ages. I'm your host, Kyle Wood, and today we're going to be looking at Mary Cassatt. I'm really excited because today my guest is the curator for an upcoming exhibition, or I guess it will be open as of the time this episode is released. But Emily Beeny is an art historian and the curator for the exhibition Mary Cassatt at Work. Thank you so much for joining me.
Such a pleasure to be here.
So just right off the bat, I want to make sure that we get all the exhibition information out there because this seems like it is going to be a wonderful show put together at the Legion of Honor in San Francisco. Do you want to tell us a little bit about the show, when it opens, how long it's going to be running, all of that sort of stuff?
Sure. The exhibition will be presented at the Legion of Honor here in San Francisco from October 5th, 2024 to January 26th, 2025. And it comes to us from the Philadelphia Museum of Art, where it was originated by my wonderful colleagues Jennifer Thompson and Laurel Garber.
Excellent. And I'm really excited because obviously you are the person to talk to about Cassatt. And Cassatt has been on my list to cover pretty much since I started this podcast. I mean, I have always been a huge fan of the Impressionists, and Cassatt is certainly a standout and a unique figure in that sort of critical phase in art history and development and the shift towards modernism. But before we get into all of that, I just feel like curators do a lot of work and give us insights that shape our understanding of history. Can you just explain a little bit about your role and how you went about preparing this show?
Sure. So I'm a specialist of French art, paintings and drawings of the 17th to 19th century. And here at the Legion of Honor, I'm chief curator, so I look after really the whole collection of European art. For this particular project, I came aboard about a year ago, but it's one that's been in the course of preparation for a number of years, with lots of rich original research that's gone into the catalog, particularly into Cassatt's techniques, and also quite a lot of her unpublished letters. It turns out that there's lots we didn't know before this project.
Oh, so I'm curious, what's something you discovered?
Well, I would say that Cassatt is often remembered as a kind of maybe slightly sentimental painter of mothers and children.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, she was a bold modernist pioneer, just as you said. She really, I think, kind of undercover of acceptably feminine subject matter, she kind of smuggled into her practice really radical methods of experimentation, using these kinds of iterative processes to explore the different media in which she worked, from oil paint to pastel to various printmaking techniques.
Yeah, that was something that I'm going to be honest, I learned about, I feel like relatively recently, probably even in the prep for this show. I mean, I kind of knew Cassatt was, I knew her as sort of a feminist because I believe she was a suffragist and all of that sort of stuff. But her print media, like I had always seen her paintings. I hadn't known as much about her print work. And that was something that I found really interesting because, she's doing these intaglio prints and she's doing stuff where she's using media in ways that, if I'm being 100% honest, and I have a BFA, like I went to school for this stuff, like I'm not sure I could recreate all of those methods, or it would take me a while to study. My understanding from the reading that I've done, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but she was kind of learning from the Japanese prints, but not copying their method so much. Like she was looking at the ukiyo-e stuff, but she wasn't doing woodcuts. Am I correct in that?
Totally. Yeah, and I would say that there's a strong case to be made that her most important contributions to the story of art really happen in the realm of printmaking, most especially in this set of color prints that she produces from 1890 to 91 that's known as the Set of 10. And these are color prints that represent different scenes from the lives of women living in modern Paris. So from sort of toilette scenes to scenes about, going to call on a friend for tea or taking the bus, bathing a child. And her inspiration for this series really was an exhibition that she sees at the École des Beaux-Arts in 1890 of Japanese ukiyo-e prints. She already knew about Japanese woodblock printmaking, of course, and had begun building her own small collection of these works. But seeing them in quantity at that exhibition really lit her imagination on fire. Coming out of the show, she writes a letter to Berthe Morisot, the female founding member of the Impressionist group and a friend and colleague of hers. She says, "I'm dreaming of color on copper." And what she means by that is that she has this idea of reverse engineering some of the effects of a Japanese woodblock print on a copper plate, using Western intaglio techniques to reproduce some of the same effects as those woodblock prints. But of course, what this is going to mean is producing multiple plates that will carry different parts of the design, just as in Japanese woodblock printing, but with copper plates. So it's a somewhat nightmarishly complex and super experimental process. And for the first print in the series, which is, of course, the most experimental since she's kind of feeling her way through the process for the first time, it's a print called The Bath. I believe there are 17 known states that come down to us of that print. So sort of 17 phases of reworking her plates to achieve the finished effect.
And is that the one where it's, I believe, a mother and a child almost like reaching her hand in to test the water to check, like, is it the right temperature to put the kid in, right?
Exactly. That's the one. And it's definitely the inspiration, the compositional inspiration from like the Prince of Utamaro is very, very direct.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, that's the one that struck me as the most like very Japanese looking of all of her prints. But yeah, you make a really good point. Like when you look at the prints, they seem so, I don't know, everyday, mundane kind of scenes and stuff like that. It seems so casual. It's easy to forget that like she had to make multiple plates prepped for this design. Like it's a very labor intensive process that looks very casual and relaxed.
Yeah, there is a kind of gauzy effortlessness to the finished products. But I think it's really interesting that she does preserve and indeed ultimately sign many states of these prints. She tracks her process carefully. She's working with a professional printer at her home studio, a printer called Leroy, and she actually signs both of their names to the final state, which I think is a kind of lovely tribute to that collaboration and super rare since, of course, most artists who were making prints in the period did work with master printers, but didn't acknowledge the collaboration. Yeah, I think it's interesting that she preserves all of those states and mentions the collaboration and the signing of the finished state because she wants us to get interested in her process. She allows us to sort of look over her shoulder and watch the composition evolve. And that feels like a very modernist with a capital M kind of move because it's a sign that these works of art are partly about their own making.
Yeah, that was the same sort of thought I had. It felt very perfectly in line with the Impressionist style with the heavy impasto, and we see every brushstroke, and we're consciously aware we're not looking at a landscape or a person. We're looking at somebody's painting or somebody's rendition of that figure. And I think that brings me to the bigger idea here. I feel like context is always really critically important to understanding a work of art and an artist's progression. And when I did my episode on, and I cannot pronounce her name as beautifully as you did, Berthe Morisot, we had talked about how female artists they had a rough go of things in like the 19th century, where not only were schools sometimes excluding women, I believe Cassatt was not allowed to participate in figure studies or live model drawings and stuff like that. And again, correct me if I'm wrong. But also, my guest in the Morisot episode told me how women needed like a chaperone to go different places. Can you just talk a little bit more about the historical context, like art movements and societal trends that probably shaped a lot of Cassatt's work and her viewpoint and all of that?
Sure. I think in some ways, Cassatt was fortunate to begin her training as a 16-year-old at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, which was, an environment more hospitable to women artists than she would have found if she were at that same stage in her career in France, where the, official state-sponsored school in Paris, the École des Beaux-Arts, does not admit female students until the 1890s. So she was able to get more of a kind of solid academic, educational kind of basis for her, particularly for her draftsmanship, because she becomes a really accomplished, her drawings are that undergird her paintings and that undergirds her practice as a printmaker. She's just very good at drawing, especially the human figure, in a way that is more unusual for women in France because of their exclusion from those kind of conventional spaces of instruction, particularly surrounding the drawing of the figure. And so she does kind of carve her own path. Moving to France, she is able to study early on with some really leading figures in the more official art world. So she studies with Jean-Léon Gérôme, who's sort of the towering figure in the academic scene in the 1860s. She studies with Thomas Couture, who's also the teacher of Édouard Manet. She studies with Charles Chaplin, who's the greatest pastelist of the Second Empire. And so I think this kind of solidity and just superb beauty of her pastel technique owes a lot to that early study with him. And then because she is a person of some independent means, the daughter of a very successful stockbroker, her mother was the daughter of a banker, she's able to travel widely. And I think her exposure to old master paintings in, places like Madrid and Amsterdam, all over Europe, really, and most certainly in Italy, where she also travels extensively, really leaves a deep mark on her practice. And sort of that influence, I think, resurfaces in the later years of her career, kind of after the end of the Impressionist group exhibitions in 86, as she kind of recommits to a tradition of draftsmanship, recommits to the old masters, and I think quite radically for a woman artist of her time, kind of carves out her own place in the history of art next to the old masters, partly through this mother and child theme, which obviously sets her up for comparisons to Italian Renaissance masters who painted the Madonna and Child. Does that sort of answer the question?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Like I say, I would just like to get at sort of that context, and obviously the story means a lot to me about just, not just what does her work look like, but who was she as a person, understanding, her family history and, how she adapted to circumstances and all of that.
Yeah, her financial situation, and frankly, the fact that she chooses, not to marry or have children, give her a kind of measure of freedom that many women did not enjoy in her time. I think also there are advantages and disadvantages to living most of your life as an expatriate, as she did as an American in France. But I also think that she although she navigated very skillfully, I think, the kind of social constraints placed on people of her gender in Paris, I think she also had maybe a little bit of extra leeway in certain respects as an American that someone like Berthe Morisot did not have.
Mm.
Berthe Morisot also has a different situation, of course, because her family's financial situation kind of unravels after the death of her father. She needs to get married in order to kind of survive. So
Yeah.
it's just, it's a different kind of set of circumstances.
Now, as you're putting together the exhibition, and I guess, you've kind of alluded to the fact that it's a group effort putting together these shows. You're not just walking through there saying like, oh, I think this one would be nice. But one of the things I always think about is a curator is not just looking at pieces and saying, well, this will look nice on the wall. They're putting together a collection that sort of tells a story and tells us about the work. And the title of this exhibition is Mary Cassatt at Work. That already kind of hints at the narrative you're trying to put up here. But for the listeners who do end up going to the show, or the listeners who are unable to make it to the show, can you just give us, what's the story that you're sharing with this exhibition?
Well, I think Cassatt is most celebrated, frankly, for her images of what we call women's work, whether that's needlework and knitting, whether it's bathing or nursing a child. These activities that absorbed many women's intellectual and physical and emotional energies in this period. And one of the things I think that's so interesting about Cassatt's focus on many of these themes is that at the same time, her treatments of those themes encourage us to notice her own work as an artist, the marks of her brush or her pastel stick or her etching needle. These are works that invite us into her process and encourage us to think about her as a working artist in the studio in some way. So our presentation of the exhibition in San Francisco is organized really around her biography, the sort of story and evolution of her life. I did fold in a section, though, that's called Finished, Unfinished, and it's about how many of her works, as I think you kind of alluded to a little bit earlier, have these sort of ostentatious areas of unfinish where the image dissolves into its constituent brushstrokes or marks of the pastel stick. I think her iterative printmaking processes and her preservation of all of those sort of intermediate states is part of the same kind of idea. There's a way in which she wanted us to notice her working methods, wanted us to see her brush move across the canvas, and understand her works not as transparent windows onto the world she depicted or the forms of women's work that she evokes, but rather as carefully crafted objects, made things. And so that's, I think, those are the two stories that the exhibition combines.
Yeah.
This story of her interest in the work of women, the work of caregiving, the sort of forms of concentration involved in women's work, and then her own kind of thematization of the artist's work in the studio.
Yeah, and I think all of that makes perfect sense. I mean, that's kind of what I think of with Cassatt, even in the Art History 101, we're going to give the tersest of overviews of her. The thing I vividly remember is, her sort of unique lens on women's real lives and not the idealized, through the male gaze and everything like that. And I love that you're getting into more nuance with that.
I think Yeah, certainly there's idealization that goes on in the images of women and children, the sort of quote unquote mother and child images, which of course, for which the models were often children of friends and family, and then grown-ups who were domestic employees of Cassatt's or of her friends and whom she paid to pose for her. So there too, there's an element of sort of studio fiction, professionalization. So there's an element of idealization, I think, in those pictures, but it's easy to forget just how new it was to show images of caregiving as any kind of work. That this is a first in Western art. The depiction of mothers and children not just sort of posed and smiling for the artist, although there are many happy babies in the of Cassatt, but to show that caregiving relationship as one that involves work, that involves intellectual, emotional, physical energy.
Yeah, and that is a good point that sadly 100 years later, I think we still need to learn.
All too relevant, yes.
Yeah. But after a short break, I want to get into a specific work of hers because I feel like that's where stories really come out. For this second segment, I always like to talk about a specific work, and I think I'm going to push the bounds of your generosity with your time and ask to talk about two works, because for me, I always think of Cassatt with The Girl in the Blue Chair. It's one of the most famous images out there of hers, I think. And I feel like I would be remiss if I did not get your thoughts and insights on it. But then I also want to look out for all those AP art history students in the US who might be looking to cram for tests this spring. So we might be getting into the print after that. Can we start off, though, The Girl in the Blue Chair? As you look at that, what's jumping out at you? What do you see in that piece?
Well, I'm totally thrilled that this painting is going to pay us a visit here in San Francisco. Our colleagues at the National Gallery of Art have been very generous in granting us this loan. It's one of the icons of her career, certainly, and a work that she shows in her Impressionist debut in 1879. She had submitted it the year before to the jury for the art presentation at the Exposition Universelle at the World's Fair in Paris, and it had been rejected. And for me, that's a useful piece of context in looking at a picture that I think sometimes, because it is such an icon of her work, we have a slightly coffee mug, dorm room, or dentist's office poster kind of idea of this painting. But it was radical. It was radical at the time that she painted it. And I think it was radical on two fronts. First, in the way that it represents this little girl as behaving as a real little girl who's maybe been running around, maybe a little hyper, and is now exhausted. You can imagine her kind of a little bit flushed and sweaty and just sort of sprawled in the chair, totally unselfconsciously, showing a kind of indecorous glimpse of petticoats. So, there's an element, I think, of impropriety, I guess, there. And then the way that it's painted is also very radical. The pattern of that famous blue chair isn't sort of picked out with fussy, careful little strokes. It's described with these amazing broad slashes of color. There's no forgetting when we look at this picture that it is a made thing. There's no forgetting the way that the artist painted it. She doesn't render her own brushstrokes invisible in the way that some of her academic masters like Gérôme and Chaplin would have taught her to do. It's also a picture that's sort of a monument to her friendship with Edgar Degas, the founding member of the Impressionist group, of course, most famous for his scenes of ballet dancers and horse races. But he's really the one who invited Cassatt to join the Impressionist circle, having supposedly seen her work at one of the salons, and said, "There's somebody who thinks the way that I do." So the little girl who poses for this picture is actually the daughter of one of Degas' friends. And the background, as we learned from a revelatory exhibition organized at the National Gallery of Art some years ago, was actually completely repainted by Degas. So it's Cassatt and Degas had a relationship of mutual influence and collaboration. And this kind of background with sharply receding space into that corner that seems to come up a little bit too quickly in a way, that's a very, very Degas move. And that's exactly where his intervention took place. So I think it's also both as her one of her entries to her initial Impressionist exhibition, and given all of these interventions, this painting is a really interesting testament to her friendship with Degas too. And then finally, who can resist the little griffin dog? Cassatt had a sequence of these griffin dogs as her pets. And so it's sort of sweet that he appears right above her signature, since he is also a little bit of a signature of hers.
I think, everything you said there is just so much more than I knew about this to begin with. My entry point was not the history and the connection with Degas. I knew that the two of them were associated and worked together a bit, and that he brought her into the Impressionist sort of circle. I didn't realize that he had such a direct influence over this specific piece. I always just look at this piece, and for me, it's about the emotional resonance first. And as a parent, I feel like I have seen that expression so many times from my children, even though my children do not dress like that, and all of that. Like, it's a look that on a gut level, I see it and I immediately identify with that. And to me, I think that's what makes it such a timeless piece, is that even in that age of, we associate with all this fussiness with the petticoats and everything like that, kids were always kids to the extent that they could be, I guess. And I think that's what makes this piece so iconic, and that's why it stands out so much later. Now, just to shift gears slightly, we saw the Degas influence in this one, but the one selected for the AP Art History curriculum, I can never say these words. The Coiffure, that's a print that shows distinct Japanese influence. I mean, it has that verticality. It has that like pattern with flatness, that juxtaposition. It seems like the raw paper showing through and all of that. But I should stop talking because you know more than I do. What do you see as you're looking at that piece?
Well, I totally agree with you about the Japanese influence that's written all over this object. And here too, I think specifically about the Prince of Udamaro, which for members of his culture represented, residents of the pleasure quarter, courtesans, but I think were probably received by women of Cassatt's time and class as, simply representations of women. Not unlike themselves. So there are several things about this print that, from a kind of art historical standpoint, are bold and extraordinary. It is really interesting to see a woman artist portraying a female nude, I think. And it's most interesting of all to see her pioneering this new technique, this intaglio color process that she really devised in collaboration with this master printer, they sort of pull it out of thin air. It's a totally new innovation, and her great contribution to the story of Western printmaking.
Can I just ask you, and I don't want to put you on the spot here, but for listeners not familiar with intaglio print, I always say intaglio, but I know my gruff American accent cannot do words justice. But can you just briefly explain that printmaking method?
Sure. Yeah. So by intaglio printmaking, we sort of use that term broadly to mean an array of subtractive techniques. So generally using a copper plate, and sharp implements, acid baths, other ways of intervening. You subtract material from the areas that you want to appear as line and tone when you actually pull the print. If that makes sense.
I mean, it does to me.
Obviously, because you have many prints yourself, you know a great deal more about this than I, having firsthand experience. So, from a technical standpoint, it's pretty radical. I think the beautiful patterns that you're talking about in the carpet and the wallpaper and the chair or sofa she's sitting on, and then the very sophisticated way in which some of those patterns are repeated in the reflection in the mirror. Yes, it does contribute to this extraordinary sort of flattening of space into a series of kind of intersecting planes of pattern. And that feels at once very 18th century Japanese and very, very modern in the Western sense. I think this is a print where I see artists of the next generation, people like Vuillard and Bonnat and Maurice Denis, are like waiting in the wings with a print like this. And it has a huge effect on artists, I think, of the next generation. The publication of this series plays a really determinative role in the direction of printmaking for the next generation.
Yeah, it's funny how modern in the European sense is always almost traditional from other parts of the world,
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of aesthetic traditions that were novel in Europe in this period were, of course, had much longer histories in the parts of the world from which they came. And it's this age of a new kind of global economy that sweeps a lot of these traditions together for the first time.
Yeah. And I guess for the sort of, again, historical context and why that was happening, Japan had been a closed off nation for a very long time. And they had just opened up to trade with the West in the 19th century, if I'm correct.
Exactly.
Right?
In the 1860s, there's this sort of forcible opening of Japanese ports to trade with Western powers, aside from the Dutch, actually by an American naval expedition, the expedition of Commodore Perry in the 1860s.
Yeah, and so that brought about a lot of that Japanese influence. I mean, every episode I do about an Impressionist, I feel like I'm talking about how they just absolutely loved the UKOE prints that were new and circulating at that time, and we see that again very directly here in this print. What I find really interesting is you had talked about the sort of source material that influenced her. The UKOE prints, of courtesans and everything like that. And here it's a female nude by a female artist, but it doesn't have like sexual undertones, right? It feels very just like matter of fact. This is a woman just going about her day as I see it, which I think is a different lens on it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure different people experience this image in different ways, but it doesn't seem as though it was intended to carry a sort of sexual charge in the way that, for example, Degas' contemporary brothel monotypes did have that intent.
Yeah.
And images that he actually made in the interiors of establishments where women were engaged in sex work. It's interesting that Cassatt actually did own one of those brothel monotypes, did actually own a Degas nude from that kind of equally experimental, interesting print series. But it's probably one that it's one that doesn't necessarily read as an image of prostitution. And so for her, she probably just absorbed it as a scene like this one of a woman basically at her toilette, potentially a woman of her own social class, at her toilette.
Yeah. Now, just, because I always like to wrap things up. It feels a little bit silly to wrap this up the way that I typically would with the, where does this piece belong? The Louvre, the lab, or the loo? I mean, obviously you're a museum curator talking about works in a museum. I feel like all of these belong in a museum context. But as you're looking at either, the girl on the blue armchair or, the prince, what would you say is the big takeaway? What's the lens we should use to look at this work? What's its significance? Why are these pieces that, we still care about 100 years later?
Well, for starters, I would argue because they're very beautiful. And I think that can be a sufficient and legitimate answer to that question. In addition, I would also say that I think they're of interest to many contemporary viewers as images of the lives of girls and women created by a woman who brought a fresh perspective to this subject matter that was related to her own experience and her own way, I think, of navigating the modern world. The modernity of Cassatt is different from the modernity of Degas because they experienced the modern world differently as humans, both because of their gender, because their nationality, but also just because they were different people. And so I think the kind of freshness of Cassatt's perspective is alive and well.
I could not agree more. I mean, when I set up the whole, I guess rating scale or whatever, I always said a museum piece, what belongs there is stuff that is not just informative, but stuff that's also aesthetically pleasing. It's beautiful to look at, and that's why it's cherished for the ages, because it just ticks all the boxes, and that is certainly true of Cassatt and her work. And I want to say once again, a huge thank you, Emily Beeny, the curator, bringing us this show, Mary Cassatt at Work at the Legion of Honor in San Francisco. I'm just going to say, any listeners who want to learn more, check the links in the show notes. I will have links to the museum where you can find out ticket information, all that sort of stuff, as well as if you can't make it in person, I'm sure there's plenty of information on the museum's website that you can learn more from. And I'll include links to images of both works we talked about because I can only put one in the episode cover art. But thank you once again so much. I really appreciate your taking the time.
Well, Kyle, thank you so much for having me and for focusing in this way on such a special artist.
This concludes this week's episode of Who Arted, part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. If you found this tolerable, please leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast app. You can find images of the work being discussed this week and every week on social media at Who Arted Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, and of course on the website whoartedpodcast.com. Podcast done.